like you were referring to the theory of some very difficult Greek name that I now forgot, about the demise of Athens. The demise of Sparta versus the rise of Athens, I think, and the war that then broke out. And I think you were referring to it at the time we live in now, that we have this rise of some superpowers, like, for example, China, and definitely you have the relative decline, I would say, of the West and also the United States. So I was wondering, like, are we heading for World War III, or are we actually heading for Cold War II?
So I think it's a mistake to think that any new war is going to look like the last war.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're coming into a new war, but there are new technologies, there are new ways of living. And so to suggest it's going to be like the Cold War or the Second World War or the First World War or the Battle of Marathon or whatever is the wrong way to look at it. I think World War III, whatever it is, will be its own thing. And it's going to be increasingly focused on hybrid warfare. And I think it's going to have flashpoints every now and then. But I think really it's going to, like, my concern is that it ends up being like a perpetual war type situation, because the real elephant in the room is the financial underlying fragility of the system that we've created and our exposure to the climate costs and the energy crisis, right? So this is like a civilization pivot point. And to make it through, we either do that with like some new technological advance that hasn't arrived yet, or we have to restrict and really control the population in ways that we haven't had to do for a very long time. And as we try to, create collective solutions for things like climate change, that is going to lead to power struggles between those countries that still want to develop and aren't happy to constrain their consumption at this point, right? So whatever way we're looking at it, there is definitely a transition of power going on, I think. Whether it's clear cut, I don't think it's going to necessarily be the same thing where, we move from the British Empire to the American Empire to the Chinese Empire. I suspect it's going to be more multipolar because all the empires have the same problem this time round. There is no new growth without some sort of massive innovation somewhere.
Yeah.
And in that context,
and there's massive debt everywhere.
Massive debt everywhere. And I think in that context, all these different powers, they benefit from creating a foreign enemy perspective, right? So they can rally their own people by, it's cliche, but it's the Orwellian perpetual war where, Oceania is perpetually, fearful of Eurasia and etc. And then, so you can see like China will use the West as the bogeyman, and then Russia will use the West as the bogeyman, and we will use maybe both Russia and China. I don't know. I mean, I'm not making any assumptions, and this is just my inkling is that there will be this multipolar world, and I've forgotten the question now.
Oh, well,
Thucydides trap, but
yeah.
So it's more.
You've
it's
answered
not
it.
just a Thucydides trap. It's not just that China is emerging as the new power. It's emerging into a constrained power relationship because it can't. There is this natural limit, which is the carbon situation. So, yeah, I think it's going to be for finance and markets. Also, the challenge is how you transition to growth that is increasingly dematerialized, I think.
To be honest,
and digital.
I don't see this. How is carbon really the limit, I wonder? Because how I see it more is that especially private debt is the limit. And like, how is carbon the limit? Because can't economies just grow on? And then, sure, I know that, or likely global warming will kick in and do horrible things. But isn't that largely outside of the major powers that are creating the carbon output? If you catch my drift, right? So Europe, US, China going to be fine.
Energy consumption I think energy consumption is intimately connected with growth. I think if you look at like energy consumption and growth, it tracks almost identically. And so if there's a constraint to cheap energy, and lacking an innovation like fusion or something that can give us the next growth phase, then the Roman Empire collapsed because of, frankly, not enough. They never made the innovation leap to using fossil fuels, right? So their empire got too large. They couldn't manage it. The bureaucracy got out of order, too much control, and effectively it had to break off and fragment and become the makings of the Middle Ages, right? So that's the worst case scenario for us, is that everything fragments out and we have this collapse of civilization where our energy footprint comes down, but not because we are improving our lifestyle. To the contrary, it's because everyone has to go back to the medieval times, basically. And that's the worst case scenario, right? The best case scenario is that we find a new tech and we are able to innovate our way out of it. And we should be doing everything, in my opinion, to encourage innovation so that we can make that leap. But as it stands, where we are now is in this weird middle ground where there is in my opinion, and I know people will challenge me on this, but there's a false narrative, I think, out there that the technology is here to take us into net zero. I don't agree that the technology is here. I think it's not. And because the technology is here, if the alternative is that we can't continue to mine cheap fossil fuels, then that means the growth situation. The only way you can correct for it is with basically growth being suspended on a global level. That's my take.
That's interesting. So I have to say that I don't think about it like that, but I have to add to that energy is my blind spot still a little bit. So it's not my specialty. And I do think that my bias is to make everything about money and about monetary factors.
But money is energy. I mean, the two are intimately connected. Like, everything is ultimately an input of energy. So everything, all economic activity ultimately derives from some sort of source point of energy, whether it's human energy, but human energy is powered by agriculture. Like in the Ukraine crisis right now, a much overlooked aspect of it is the nat gas situation, right?
What's the nat gas situation?
Well, there's a shortage of nat gas, and that is entirely our own doing, which has empowered Putin.
Gas on the net, you mean?
Huh?
Like, what do you mean with net gas? Like, just gas, basically, for Europe, or?
Well, natural gas.
Oh, natural gas. Okay, sorry. I was looking for the grid or the net in that. I was
natural gas. So basically, we've created a shortage through our net zero policy because in my opinion, we've run before we can walk, and pushed ahead with policies that have constrained for years and years, the interim solution for this problem was that we would transition through nat gas. And nat gas was actually going to be, it's like an ironic behavioral thing where even though technically it's still a fossil fuel, because it's a much less intensive expenditure of carbon, it's still a net gain to basically transition from oil and coal to nat gas. And you're going to get greater savings from doing that than going like cold turkey to net zero, because when you go net zero, you have to spend a lot more fuel, actual carbon fuel, to create all those like renewable resources in the first place. And secondly, the people who can't afford those resources will end up using much dirtier and cheaper fuels like wood and coal. And that's exactly what's happened in Germany, which is that, the fact that Germany has now closed its nuclear production and has made itself entirely dependent on Russian gas, ironically, is incredibly that was and it wasn't even a blind spot. It was so well flagged. So that to me is like handing over control to Putin. I mean, it was
that emboldened Putin to invade Ukraine. If I can make it concretely, is that sort of what you're saying?
Well, yeah, because we're in a situation where he calls the shots because we can't sanction him properly because then we don't get any energy or food, and it translates into food because nat gas is a key component in the production of food and fertilizer. So without nat gas, we've already got, because of the cost of nat gas, this was very well flagged in November, which is why when I went on some news channel in November, I was saying that February would be the moment that everything would come to the fore, because it was clear that that would be the time that our gas stocks would be entirely depleted. And at that point, that would be peak Putin power, because he has us over a barrel, because he can dictate whatever he wants. But also in the interim, gas prices have been so high that farmers haven't bought the fertilizer they need, because they were hoping prices would go down, but they haven't come down. So this now looks like that this will lead to like a 5 to 10% yield destruction in farming in Europe this year. They're planting late already, and likely to plant even later because of the lack of fertilizer. That makes Ukraine a kingmaker asset, because Ukraine is one of the biggest grain producers in the world. Mm-hmm. And if you think that, in terms of gas, the balance point is Qatar and the LNG producers who are now balancing the imbalances. Ukraine provides the balancing grain assets. So it's like having the SPR of grain if you control Ukraine. And, you dictate if Egypt gets food or not, because through the Black Sea, so much of the grain from Ukraine goes to the Middle East. So Putin knows this, and I don't think the implications on food have really been thought through properly. This isn't a conspiracy. This is just practical, pragmatic analysis.
Yeah, and this story is not in the news much, right? So this is why we need the blind spot.
Yeah. It's one of the stories that I think is like, that's the sort of bigger geopolitical thing. It's so easy to go knee jerk, like, remember even the Gulf War, everyone's just, it's easy to like have a very simplistic take on this, but power, money, capital is ultimately I'm an ancient historian. That's what I studied at university. And those are the three things that determine all geopolitics ultimately. And I think it's very, very naive to think that there aren't massive sort of political level, plans being laid to try and like gain access and control over these things.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you have, to a certain extent, opened my eyes a little bit about this energy issue, in the sense that, so the piece of the puzzle that I didn't see is that what you mentioned about fertilizers for farmers here in Europe. Because I did know that like both Russia and Ukraine are massive wheat producers. And what I found is that, so Egypt, like you mentioned, but also I think Indonesia and Vietnam are massive importers of wheat from Russia and the Ukraine. But I didn't make the connection to Europe, because I'm from the Netherlands myself, which is also a massive agriculture producer. But basically, you are saying that our farmers, if I can say that, now have a fertilizer problem, because that was not on my radar. So so that's super interesting. I will definitely look into that.
They have a fertilizer problem. They also have, just generally, they're going to have to compete increasingly with international markets for a lot of their input costs. So just general inputs, amongst which, and then there's other like commodity related things, like helium is also a controlling asset an asset that people want to control at the moment, because that's got shortage issues. And helium is a vital component in semiconductors.
And
there aren't that many helium.
Who has it?
So helium can be made. So the connection between helium and nat gas is that nat gas is used in the helium extraction process.
Okay.
So de facto, even if Ukraine doesn't like it, the gas impacts the helium, because without it's like fertilizer you need the gas to get the fertilizer. So that's the connection of helium.
Damn. Yeah. You're making me worried.
Sorry.
But the one connection that I did think about, that I think is interesting, like there's now, at least on YouTube, there's this massive sort of conspiracy gut feeling, if you will, about sort of the end of the world and sort of the crashing of most economies. And what I do think is interesting is that you mentioned specifically, like very often these gut feelings have a grain of truth to them, but it's just like the information that's actually relevant is not packed into these theories. But you are coming across as really strongly arguing or believing in a massive regime shift that's starting just now. And is that a correct summary?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of massive geopolitical change going on at the moment. I think there is the period of, I'm a historian ultimately, and I think we all get very complacent about this idea that the end of history, and that things history always progresses and it only goes up. I'm of the ancient history school of Polybius. I see things in cycles, and I don't think it's wise to, as soon as you think it's going to be one way, it's usually not. So that's how blind spots occur, when you get complacent and when the crowd becomes convinced that X is always going to be X, you can be damn sure there's going to be something that pops that bubble, and no one will have seen it coming.